Today on the Better Youth Ministry channel, we're talking about an issue that a lot of youth pastors face, working at a dying church. And what brought this up for me is that a friend of mine recently told me that the church he attended for several years just had its final worship service. They had to close down for good. And before we talk about what happened, I want to tell you who I am. I'm Trevor. I've been working in youth ministry for over a decade now. Right now, I'm at a large contemporary church, but I've also worked at a few smaller traditional churches along the way. You can find me over at betteryouthministry.com. That's where I try to share some practical tips and strategies to help other youth pastors do ministry better. So I hope you'll check out the site. This video actually began as a blog post over on the site. So when you get a chance, check that out. So what happened at my friend's church that got them to the place where they actually had to close the doors? Well, first off, it's happening a lot. It's not just that church. According to Ed Stetzer's research, somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 churches close their doors for the final time every single year. And we have to understand that churches, just like businesses, just like restaurants, just like technology and ideas, churches have a life cycle. And that means that they have a time of growth, followed by a plateau, which is eventually followed by a time of decline. And if a church or business doesn't reinvent itself, then what it'll do is it'll slide down the curve until it's finally dead. Aubrey Malphurs is a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. He explains the cycle like this. In general, a church is born, and over time it grows. Eventually it reaches a plateau, and if nothing is done to move it off that plateau, it begins to decline. If nothing interrupts the decline, it will die. So at some point, there comes a point of no return. And when that point is crossed, it's like knocking over the first in a series of dominoes. It's what I call the domino effect at a dying church. And the first domino is so important because that's the one that when it falls, it starts knocking down all the rest of the dominoes. And I think the first domino, the one that sets the whole thing in motion, is that the church gets off of its mission. The mission of the church is not up for debate. It's not dependent on people's preferences or opinions. The mission of the church comes from Jesus. It's called the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. That's Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. And that's the Great Commission. That's the mission of the church. And that mission isn't up for debate. And you'll notice that it's got two prongs to it. It involves reaching and teaching. And so good teaching should inspire Christian people to do more reaching. And then more reaching should require us to pay attention to the quality of our teaching. It's like two wings of a plane. It's going to take both of those to keep the church in flight, reaching and teaching. Unfortunately, Drew Goodmanson has found that half of all churches last year did not add one new member through conversion growth. So it seems to me that a church's failure to lead people to Christ is really just a symptom that indicates a larger problem. The church is off its mission. When that domino falls, it bumps into the second one. So here's the second domino to fall. Leaders leave. When people who value forward progress, those would be leaders, when they begin to recognize that the church is off of its mission and that it really has no plans to reinvent itself or try to change things, those leaders leave to find places that are making forward progress. And sure, some churches have been able to reinvent themselves and break out of the decline, but leaders leave when they sense that this particular church doesn't seem really very interested or ready to make those changes. And then the third domino to fall is that followers leave. Followers follow leaders. So because key leaders are leaving the church, followers figure out that something's not right, and then they decide to leave too. The rate of people leaving the church begins to outpace the rate of people joining the church, and that leads to the next domino to fall. Budgets freeze. Here's what happens. When people leave, they take their money with them, and that creates a money shortage that freezes budgets. You know that it takes money to do ministry, and when the money isn't there, you can't do ministry the way that you need to. So the fifth domino to fall is that quality drops. You can't keep doing things to the level you were doing them before, and when the quality takes a hit, more people leave. So budgets go from being frozen to eventually being reduced. Quality continues to suffer, only it's a lot more noticeable now. More people leave, and eventually the next domino falls. Staff cuts. The church can't afford to pay all of its staff members anymore, so someone has to be laid off. And who do you think are the most likely candidates to be laid off? It's not the senior pastor. It's not the music minister. It's the family ministries positions. The children's director, the student pastor, or both will eventually have to be cut. And after those staff members are gone, their departments start to suffer from the lack of dedicated attention and effort that they were giving. When that happens, the young families who value the impact of children's ministry and student ministry on their kids' lives, those young families decide to leave and find a church where those departments are strong. And so that bumps into the eighth domino that falls. Average age rises. The people who don't leave are usually older people whose kids are already out of the house, so they don't really mind that the children's ministry classrooms have dirty carpet and that there's no one other than untrained volunteers to lead the students. Eventually, what you have left is a small congregation with an increasing average age, and that congregation is not either interested or able to attract new people or new families. Eventually, the dying church will simply be content to pay a pastor and a traditional music minister to provide what I think is essentially the organizational equivalent to hospice care until finally the last domino falls. When the money runs out, the church has to close. Even though the church isn't a business, it faces the same fate when there's no money left. It has to close its doors. And this sad scene is played out at almost 300 churches every month across the United States. I mean, that's amazing when you think about it. Almost 300 churches close their doors for the final time every single month. Your church is not immune to that fate. So if you work at a church that's dying, it seems to me that you have three options. You could try to be a change agent. You could stay through the slide, or you could leave. Those are really your only three options. Now, having been in that position myself, I have worked at a church that is dying. I can tell you that I went with option one. That's where I started. I tried to be a change agent. And when that didn't work, I was finally left with no choice but to go with option three because I was not really willing to try option number two. Some of the older staff members were perfectly content and fine to go with option number two. I think that as they looked forward, they saw their retirement date happening before the church had to finally close its doors. I'm younger than that, and I was not really willing to try number two. So option three is safe. Option one is risky. There was a senior pastor where I live who tried option one after he'd been at a church for about 2 years. So it's not like he was trying to rush big changes or anything. But he encountered so much resistance from the deacons at the church that he finally had to leave. So the option you choose is ultimately up to you. I would tell you to pray about it, talk with some wise older Christians about what to do. I'd even engage with the senior pastor about what you see happening and ask for his opinion about where your church is at on the life cycle that I mentioned earlier. There's really no right or wrong choice. God might call you to stick it out. Who knows? I do know that churches can turn around and be revitalized, but it takes a lot of effort and commitment from some key leaders in order to make that happen. And it's usually not a series of these small tweaks that turns things around. It takes a massive overhaul to the way things are currently done. So if you're up for that and your church is willing to change, then option one might be the way to go. If you encounter resistance at every turn, then it might be time for you to look for a new job. That's all for this episode on the Better Youth Ministry channel. I hope you've gotten some clarity around this tough issue. I'd love to read your comments, thoughts, or reactions below. And hey, when you get a chance, be sure to follow us over on Twitter at Better Youth Men. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. and I hope that you'll check out the next video.